Thank you.
So it is indeed a pleasure to share the stage with you, sir.
No. I'm just delighted to be here. I've been following MicroConf from the tweets for several years, and this is like the one conference. I'm totally serious. This is the one conference I really wanted to go to this year, and so yeah, it's really fun to be here.
To give you an example of the kind of guy Patrick is, we just met for the first time, about an hour ago, and he says, "What would make this a win for you?" And I'm thinking, you've raised $280 million, right? $5 billion valuation now?
That's right.
In the neighborhood? I read it on TechCrunch or something. So
everything you read there is accurate.
That's what So I've heard. So, my first question, obviously, you know the group here. There's early stage entrepreneurs. Most of us are self-funded. There are some folks who raise funding. We're not, anti that stance or anything. There are times when it makes sense. In the early days of Stripe, you're basically going against this behemoth of the payment card industry, right? So which was more difficult, building the tech or getting over the massive amounts of red tape that exist in that industry?
Good question. So, for context here, on the one hand, I feel a little bit like sort of, not the ideal MicroConf attendee because, as you pointed out, Stripe is not exactly sort of a bootstrapped business anymore. But Stripe, like the impetus behind it, really did come from a lot of our friends being sort of in this community and sort of themselves trying to build bootstrapped businesses. I mean, they were the kinds of businesses that needed payment processing, right? And that weren't just funded by VC dollars. And John and I were just so struck by the fact that for so many of them, they either spent weeks or months setting up the payment side of things, or the more interesting one was people had these ideas or they created these free products and they didn't even charge for it because it's, I'll go solve it later. It was kind of too much hassle. They never sort of got over the activation energy. And then I think in some ways that had major downsides because some of them didn't discover that some of their products or ideas could in fact be sort of quite viable businesses. So anyway, that's sort of the general origin. It was basically as painful and as awkward and as complicated to deal with the legacy finance industry entities as you might think. And I remember sort of when we again first started thinking about the idea, we knew nothing about the sort of the morass of things that sort of vaguely fit together, but we sort of didn't quite know how they fit together, right? And so I remember going to the authorized.net website, and they had some PDF guide to how the payment industry works. And I read the guide, and shit, I was definitely more confused after reading that guide. And there were gateways and ISOs and processors and acquirers and banks and issuing banks and acquiring banks and yeah, good Lord.
Your IQ dropped 10 points. Just
and I don't have many to spare, but so we were sort of trying to figure out all of that stuff, and then we went and we talked to some banks, and I remember we managed to sort of get a meeting pretty early on actually with Wells Fargo, and went and met with somebody there. And we were sort of describing our idea to them, and we're going to build this kind of full stack payments solution, and it'll sort of replace all the different sort of segmented components that had previously existed in the industry. And again, pitching this nice, well-intentioned person who had sort of agreed to take some time out of her day to meet with these kind of completely unproven entrepreneurs, and I don't think she sort of quite thought it was either a good idea or that sort of we're the people that build it. And I imagine, I don't know if she had a security button under her desk, but if she had, I suspect she would have been pushing it. But it really did not go over well. And sort of jokes aside, we managed to build an MVP of Stripe fairly quickly, and sort of just kind of built it on top of an existing payment system. And so we didn't actually solve the hard problems, but it did sort of provide a way for people to just get a sense for what the product experience might be like if we'd actually managed to solve the kind of hard financial infrastructure questions underneath. And then it took us from that MVP and sort of getting the first production user, it took us about, call it 15, 16 months until we sort of actually got sort of proper banking and financial industry deals done. And indeed required us kind of raising investment. And so, yeah, there's certainly lots of technical challenges that come with Stripe, although honestly, they've kind of come later in many ways. It's just kind of the scaling issues that arise kind of at high volume. It was fairly straightforward to build the first kind of prototypes. The payments industry stuff was definitely hard.
And so you bootstrapped it then until, I mean, you built that MVP essentially as a bootstrap company. You didn't raise funding until that 15, 16-month period after you already had something.
Yeah, so basically the timeline was John and I started working on this when we were in school. And we had previously worked in a company that had gone through Y Combinator. And so that was kind of how we got to know some of the kind of entrepreneurship community. And then, one of our friends worked in this company. You guys probably know it, Instant Domain Search. And so we had a sort of a lot of friends kind of through that community building various sorts of bootstrapped businesses, which again is kind of how we came to perceive the problem. And so John and I were in school. We kind of wanted something to work on the side. We actually were also working on these iPhone apps, it was sort of a suite of iPhone apps that stored an offline copy of Wikipedia. So you could read Wikipedia, without internet access, which was sort of great for traveling, right? It was very fun to work on. It sort of generated some side income. It like helped us pay for school. And so we were kind of really sold in this idea of like side projects, and especially profitable side projects. And so then we were sort of wondering about the kind of weird incongruity where it was actually very easy to charge for iPhone apps. You just like told Apple how much you wanted to charge for it, right? And then it was kind of so difficult to do this on the web where sort of most other things are actually easier, right? Because the App Store approval process and all this stuff. So in school, decided to go work on this. We funded it ourselves, partially from the iPhone app revenue and partially just out of savings. It wasn't that expensive to pay the hosting bill. It was whatever, $20 a month on SliceHost, which I still miss. Then for about 8 or 9 months, we funded it ourselves out of savings. And at that point, it was definitely kind of only viable for us to work with sort of very, very forgiving users, like our friends, basically, in that the very first user was a company called 280 North. They were kind of selling they worked in the web framework Cappuccino, which some of you might know. They were sort of selling this interface builder. We're kind of standard lean startup methodology style. We're just only building the things they needed. We only had Ruby bindings because they were using Ruby. We enabled them to sort of charge their customers, and then Ross at 280 North would ask, how do I see how much money I've made, right? And we'd go, good point, and we'd like go build like a quick web dashboard. And then he's like, how do I refund a payment? And we're like, excellent suggestion. And we'd like build a refund thing. And then after a couple of weeks, Ross is like, so when do I get my money? And so I went and built the transfer logic. And so could only have worked with our friends, basically. And again, because it was being funded from savings, you really had to just kind of trust us as people to take a bet on it. And then that summer, which is now kind of 8 months into it, that's when we sort of decided to kind of change from being a side project to sort of actually trying to build this seriously. And we went and we raised some money from Peter Thiel.
Right, and in a business like this, this is one of the someone's calling me. Is someone in the audience calling me on the phone? This is a kind of business that you just can't get away without raising money. Like you can't bootstrap a Stripe, without having a big bucket of money because you don't have the kind of the credibility, right, with the banks as well as the people who are going to be your end users.
Yes. Sorry, I guess kind of two things became apparent to us. First was that kind of we initially thought of Stripe as, again, for people kind of like us or like our friends building these sort of, again, bootstrapped businesses. We really believe that sort of charging people for things was more conducive to good products than advertising-based business models, but sort of fundamentally for the people like us who we saw running into these issues. And then through that sort of 8-month period, we basically came to realize that it seemed like a Stripe, or as it was then, Dev Payments, might be more useful for a broader set of people than we'd initially thought. We sort of started getting all of these kind of inbound requests and sort of just word-of-mouth inquiries from people who we would never have thought of as being kind of in our original target audience. And so we kind of came to think that Stripe might be more than just sort of a little side project to work on while in school. And then the second thing was exactly as you say. I mean, it's all well and good to sort of be pursuing a sort of a very lean startup methodology with very forgiving initial users, but if you're actually going to go and execute this seriously and sort of try to build it properly, no one in the industry is going to take you seriously unless you're sort of, unless there's a high probability that it looks like you'll be around for the long term, unless you're well capitalized, unless people can really trust and rely upon you. And so I think for our particular business, it would be very difficult to self-fund it.
Right, and having a check from Peter Thiel, I'm sure, gave you a bit of credibility in that space.
Yeah, I really admire him for being willing to invest because, I mean, this is, you know, I guess the sort of naivety of youth, and that, again, we're in school, we went and met with him, and basically we spent sort of an hour telling him why kind of PayPal sucked, right? And, you know, if in future years, you know, someone is pitching me on why Stripe is terrible, I wish I could be confident that my reaction would be to sort of want to invest in them, but to his credit, he, on the spot, agreed to invest $200,000. And absolutely that sort of, I mean, not overnight, but sort of led to the sort of the train of events that eventually actually led to us working with Wells Fargo. And so kind of ironically, that bank that had sort of, you know, I think entirely understandably declined to work with us back when we were kind of two kids in college, then ended up being the sort of fundamental enabler of the first version of Stripe.
So I'm interested, you know, I heard about Stripe originally, it was word of mouth, right? And I was actually being interviewed on a podcast, and I think it was Derek Bailey who asked me, so what do you think about Stripe? Because I was using PayPal Web Payments Pro at the time, and I had an authorized.net account, which was a fucking catastrophe. But Derek says, he says, what do you use? And I said, PayPal Web Payments Pro, and he says, what do you think of Stripe? And I was like, what's Stripe? And it's shocking to, you know, it's somewhere recorded. That I didn't, but show of hands, who else heard about it purely word of mouth, like someone saying, you gotta check this thing out? Yeah, so obviously, a lot, so was that like your number one traction channel in the early days? Did you really, I mean, were you the 1 in 10,000 business that just built a better mousetrap and then people talked about it? Or was there something else that you guys did intentionally to get that word spread in the early days?
So, that's amazing that so many people have heard about it here through word of mouth. So, in general, I think it's my sense. Like, I've only built sort of one company or business to sort of any sort of scale, and so I want to be kind of careful about overgeneralizing from our particular experiences. Maybe if I'd gone through this 10 times, I'd have sort of a better, you know, distribution to sort of sample from. But I generally think that in the early days, and this is the advice I now try to give folks, I think that businesses tend to overweight analytics and metrics and underweight subjective experiences and the sort of incomparable kind of high bandwidth data that you get from just watching people use the product. And so we would, kind of, and back to this kind of friends using the product point, we would obsessively just observe them using Stripe in the early days, right? And we would go like meet them at coffee shops and have them integrate Stripe. We would have them kind of speak their questions aloud as they use the product, as they sort of, you know, encountered roadblocks and as they looked for things they expected to exist but didn't actually exist and so forth. We tried to figure out additional ways to go and build this kind of dynamic into the product. And so for the first Stripe users, every single web request and every single, like in the dashboard, and every single API request generated an email to myself and John's inboxes. And so we would just see precisely what they were doing with the product. And we'd see that, well, they're sort of sending this API request and it's triggering this error, and they're like repeatedly kind of triggering this erroneous API request. I mean, clearly something is off in the quick start guide or in the documentation or whatever, right? Or they're maybe, you see some kind of usage pattern in the dashboard which sort of suggests a demand path that you should kind of optimize, you know, more properly or something like that. We built a little widget into the bottom of the dashboard and the bottom of the docs that sort of allowed them to just type a sentence and kind of hit enter, and that again would immediately go to our inbox. And so sort of rather than send a support request, they can just sort of complete the thought that's kind of half baked in their head. And then we realized that we could increase the response rate to that if instead of just having a blank box, we would start the thought for them. And so we thought up a bunch of placeholder texts. We had, I really wish this page had, ellipsis, or the worst thing about this page is, ellipsis, stuff like that. And then people, almost without helping it themselves, like started completing the thought and filling in the box. And so again, we got this like really kind of high bandwidth feedback. And so I don't know if it's kind of accurate or not, but I attribute sort of us being so lucky and having this word of mouth to just basically spending just under 2 years in this iterative loop, such that, because we started working on Stripe as a side project in October 2009, we launched it publicly in September 2011, and so there was just under 2 years of this kind of iteration. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is also we had the just good fortune, I guess, where these weren't the, PayPal website, Payments Pro, it kind of tells you everything you need right there in the name, right? These weren't the best optimized products, and yet they were sort of super important. And so I think there are other domains where sort of the incumbents are already pretty good, and it's kind of harder to make like if I was going to go build project management software, for example, I think there were sort of a lot of, people have tried a lot of things there, a lot of really good people have worked in that space. I'm not sure sort of such a large improvement as possible, but because of the barriers to entry in the industry, we were competing against the Payments Pros and the authorized.nets, and so I think that was also just more intrinsically favorable.
Right, and it sounds like your obsession with product and UX and just making it easy for folks was a big part of that.
Yeah, and I did not know terms like UX and sort of user research and the methodologies and so forth at the time. It's kind of been funny now to discover things like MicroConf, where it's sort of, people are sort of talking more knowledgeably about the kinds of things we sort of had some instincts around. But yeah, for us, it was basically just the unglamorous work of just obsessively watching people use the product constantly and then fixing the shit that was stupid.
That's a good way to put it. So in addition to word of mouth then, take us back to, let's say 2011, you launched, and in that first year, was growth brisk, or was it, flat for a while? And what were your two, I know word of mouth was a big one, but What was there another traction channel that you guys really took a hold of?
Yes, so growth for us is kind of weird because there's two kinds of growth, right? There's the number of businesses built on Stripe grows, and then obviously, or at least in some cases, hopefully many cases, the businesses themselves grow, right? And they can grow with sort of enormous lag in that, Instacart, for example, is a business that is built on Stripe, but Instacart signed up for Stripe as apurva.meta@gmail.com, right? And so just like this random Gmail address signs up for Stripe someday, and when a Gmail address signs up, it's so difficult for us to know how to weigh it, right? What it's going to become. I mean, even the user themselves, of course, does not know what it's going to become. And so we had some difficulty in the early days kind of measuring our growth, which sounds kind of funny, right? But we could tell that like there are more Gmail addresses this week than last week, but we sort of didn't have a sense for what they were going to become, or were we having the right kinds of people sign up. And so again, we used to sort of really try to go talk to the people, talk to them about what they were building, and just try to get some kind of qualitative sense with which to augment the data. And even now, it's wild to see, for say, the cohort that signed up in 2011. I mean, it's still growing really quickly. Like, we still ourselves to this day have not learned how valuable was the cohort that signed up for Stripe in 2011. So that's kind of just the general caveat on growth. And I think that's, a lot of businesses obviously have kind of some amount of negative churn or sort of, net adds in their MRR growth. But I think it's kind of, it's more acute for us. Maybe it's comparable to AWS, where it's also kind of in proportion to the scale of the business. In terms of distribution channels, we also, I guess, realized that the developer and entrepreneurship communities, and obviously they kind of blend together to a large degree, but somewhat overlap, or somewhat different, but largely overlapping. people really like to, those communities have become more efficient, basically, more efficient at sharing information. And that I think 10, 15 years ago, just there weren't these forums. There was no Hacker News, there was no Twitter, there was no MicroConf, there were no podcasts. Just there weren't sort of effective channels for disseminating good advice, good insights, and helping people kind of discover good products. And so I think kind of the good news is that for people building good products, the world has gotten better at sort of quickly reacting to that without sort of a multi-year, multi-decade kind of billboard-driven ground war. And I think just by being participants in the community, by being active on Twitter and Hacker News and listening to podcasts and all these things, we never kind of thought about it especially formally, but we had kind of some amount of intuitive sense for that. And so we just optimized Stripe and sort of our communications to be like the kind of things we wanted to read as members of that community to sort of Amir mentioned, and I think he's 100% right, just writing things as if you're writing to your friends. I mean, that is exactly the advice that we give internally within Stripe. And I think because not that many companies had done it sort of when Stripe launched or had kind of realized that the world had changed to that extent, we're kind of in the, again, fortunate position where we were one of the first. And so, I think we benefit from that. Having said that, I mean, I think that only works because people actually wanted to share it in the sense that, hey, there is now this better thing. You no longer have to use one of the legacy incumbents. And so you could argue that it's not actually that different from just building a good product.
Sure. I'm curious, what metrics did you monitor in the early days to figure out whether a customer was like a good, profitable customer? Or did you monitor anything in the early days? It sounds like you may not have had much. And how does that contrast with what you're monitoring today?
So, so in the early days, the thing I monitored most closely, we monitor just like the total kind of dollar flow moving through Stripe, just as kind of a general, it's sort of like the heart rate on a patient. It's like if for example, the dollar flow rate was falling, something is clearly broken. But I'm not sure that we could sort of know a whole lot more or infer a whole lot more from that metric, because, for example, if it's growing faster or slower, that could mean there's some seasonality at play. It could mean that the businesses themselves aren't doing as good a job as they want. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with Stripe and so forth. And so we didn't. It's
an aggregate metric, so it's a little hard to get inside.
Right. And again, we didn't even fully realize the extent to which this is true at the time, but there's just such kind of huge latency in it. The one that I really kind of paid attention to, which isn't really a metric, but is the sort of qualitative measure, is whenever I saw something cool get built that charged people, I would just go look at what they were using for payments. And if they weren't using Stripe, I would go ask them why aren't they using Stripe. And sometimes it was because they just hadn't heard of it, obviously, especially in the early days, or perhaps we were missing some kind of functionality. I mean, before we were available in other countries, it was very often because Stripe is not available in Canada or in Germany or whatever. And just listen to those reasons. And actually, still to this day, I pay a huge amount of attention to that one, because it's sort of the leading indicator for what the world will look like 5, 10 years down the line. Having said that, I think we were too slow to I've kind of given all these general kind of epistemic caveats about sort of how much we can tell from the sort of quantitative measures in Stripe. But I think that we were too slow to kind of take advantage of them as much as we could have. And so we now have an analytics team of 4 or 5 people. And actually, I just before this, I was looking through our automated weekly report where we've kind of instrumented everything and sort of iterated upon it to sort of figure out what the most helpful measures are in sort of every major different part of the company, be it sort of the onboarding flow or usage of the different products or whatever the case might be. And that has ended up being sort of extremely useful, both in sort of detecting anomalies or just kind of weird behaviors where we've inadvertently broken something, or in discovering places that are sort of things are actually working very well and we just sort of hadn't realized, and we should kind of go take it more seriously. And so, I'm not sure how sort of generally applicable this advice is, but certainly if you start where we did, really weighting the qualitative stuff, it turns out the actual metrics themselves are very important too.
Indeed. So, did you ever look in the early days at what you were doing and have serious, let's say, doubts or regrets? Like, are there things that you feel like you wish you could do over? Did you guys hit a low point where you were?
There were definitely low points, and this is, I was having dinner with a friend a few nights ago, and I was telling him that I'm not sure that kind of no matter what happens to Stripe, I don't think I would ever start another company, just because it's so difficult, even when it works well, that I'm not sure I have the sort of emotional energy to sort of go through all of that again.
I tell my wife that every year.
I think you probably get like some number of years to sort of be really invested in it, or at least, well, evidently, because there's existence proof of this, some people have sort of immense fortitude for it. I do not think I have infinite fortitude. I think maybe I can spend sort of 10 years in the building phase, but it's not unbounded. And certainly in Stripe's case, I mean, in many ways we had this sort of we're incredibly lucky, right? In that we're in a large market. We're sort of building a product for people who are just really fun to be around. In that, there exist other businesses where I sort of feel sorry for them because they don't get to work with entrepreneurs all the time. It's like the most fun user base to work with. And generally the product has sort of grown, kind of pretty well year over year, and so we don't have a whole lot to complain about, right? And yet, even despite that, like the world really manages to surprise you, sort of day by day, in how many things can go wrong, and like, including today. In fact, I woke up this morning to an email and I was like, shit, that was a piece of bad news that I didn't realize I could get. And it's nothing terrible. I mean, in fact, quite the contrary. What you realize is that sort of past some scale, like the world will succeed in surprising you in this way essentially every day, right? And I think there's kind of this weird thing in the sort of the entrepreneur mentality where, this is the sort of two extremes, right? You can really react to each of these and sort of fully internalize the extent to which the sky is falling, you're fucked, this is terrible, like really have it weigh on you, and so forth. Or you can be kind of blithely, kind of Pollyanna-ish and sort of skip along merrily despite these bad things happening. And I think if you're the former, just starting a company is going to be utterly miserable. You probably shouldn't do it. And if you're the latter, you'll really enjoy it, but you'll fail because you won't react to the problems. And so you kind of need to be somewhere in between of like actually grokking all of the problems and internalizing them to some degree, but sort of somehow able to kind of function as an ostensibly normal human most of the time. And I think that's genuinely a tough challenge, and really has been for us. And so, I feel kind of bad in some way talking about it because we, again, don't have a whole lot to complain about. I think, Tracy's story, for example, like that's real tenacity. Like we have not had to demonstrate our mettle kind of in the same way. But even when things go as Stripe did, there have absolutely been evenings where I've said, John and I have had to sort of console ourselves in different ways.
So, to summarize that, when it fails, it's hard, and when it works, it's even harder? Is that
I'm not sure it's even harder, but yeah, I think if you're hoping for sort of a blissful existence, neither path is good.
Yeah, it seems like, I like that. It seems like entrepreneurship, no matter what happens, there's gonna be struggles. So is there something that sticks out to you about a decision you guys made, or something like a big regret you have that you wish you could go back and do differently as you were maybe launching, growing, just over the past 3-4 years?
You can tell this is like an entrepreneurship event. It's all the bad things, when you regrets. Yes. something that's, I think, very deeply internalized sort of across Stripe, and the sort of mentality John and I really had, and I kind of described it a little bit, is sort of this idea of, broadly speaking, being willing to do things that don't scale, I'd be willing to just, if a thing needs to get done, sort of roll up our sleeves and just go do it. And I think this is common to many, perhaps almost every kind of early stage company. We've really kind of fought very hard to retain it as Stripe grows. When a new class of Stripes starts on Monday, the first thing they do is John and I meet with them. We spend an hour and a half with them, and one of the things we impress upon them is this notion of sort of nothing is anyone else's job. There is no task that is beneath you. I mean, you've probably been hired in some particular role, but maybe the company's needs will change, and you should not join a startup if you're not excited about the fact that you might be called upon to do, I mean, almost anything at all at some future point. I think that mentality is kind of generally good. The kind of problematic flip side is not being kind of disciplined and rigorous enough about how things need to scale. And both Tracy and Amir sort of talked about this, but we, partially because we didn't kind of want to, it seems tempting fate to sort of believe the curves and think, well, in a year's time, we're going to need to be doing 10x more of this, right? Because you kind of think in the back of your mind as the sort of eternal pessimist, oh, something terrible will happen, and that's not really going to occur. And then partially, you sort of have this founder mentality of, well, if 10x more of it needs to happen next year, we'll just work 10x harder. And turns out that you can sort of 10x the number of hours you work in the day, as we discovered. And so as a consequence, then we were sometimes, I think, behind the curve in terms of where we had to be in just automating processes or sort of figuring out how to scale different functions of the company. And so were we to do it all again, I think, again, it feels like tempting fate to sort of invest to the point of, where you think you're going to need to be. But I would do more of that.
Right. So stuff that may have felt or seemed like premature optimization at the time, in retrospect, would actually have been a good move since you guys were growing so quickly.
Right. Now, and there's, again, there's a question of sort of, is this the right advice only in the cases where sort of it actually happens, and that, of course, there are also instances where the people invested for the scale and it didn't happen, and they were probably, sitting at other events saying, don't assume the scale, just do the unscalable way for as long as possible. And so it's hard to know, but at least in our case, I wish, even now, I wish we were doing more of that.
Very cool. Well, I have one more question for you, and then we'll wrap up and head to lunch. So at Drip, we use Stripe, obviously, and we keep getting people asking us if we're going to add EFT, electronic funds transfer. So is that something that's coming up in Stripe? That's really why I brought you up here. It'd be awesome to have a little button on that one screen. No. But
I would actually genuinely, part of the reason I came here is to hear Stripe feedback, and so this is actually great, and I'd love to hear it from anyone else here. But I've been taking notes all morning, but on EFT in particular, I mean, so there's different, for people not who haven't read the authorize.net multi-page PDF guide. EFT is electronic funds transfer, kind of interbank transfer. There are many different kinds. There's ACH in Europe, ACH in the US. There's SEPA in Europe. There's BACS in the UK. There's a bunch of different systems. The good news is we actually just launched our ACH support in the US, and so you can now do EFT in the US. Just arbitrarily between bank accounts. It's publicly available. It works with our sort of subscription stack, and so you can just attach a bank account to a customer the way you might attach a credit card to a customer, and everything will just like automatically work the right way. And this actually points to something where we did not, I think, at Stripe invest the way we ought to have, and so we're really behind the curve in building out a marketing function. And I don't mean marketing in terms of again, putting out billboards, but even just the sort of very prosaic aspects of helpfully telling people about the things that are relevant to their interests that you now have that you did not have before. And so, Stripe didn't have ACH support 3 months ago. We now do. We as this demonstrates, have done a very poor job of telling people about it.
Luckily, Des, trainer, covered that yesterday morning about a
right.
similar.
No, every time I talk to Des, I almost get physically itchy at just like how poor a job we're doing of all the things he talks about. He's wonderful, and he's advised us and helped us a lot over the course of Stripe. But we're failing at that. And so, the good news is we're succeeding at having EFT, and the bad news is we're failing at that last mile.
Well, 230-something people, I think, now know about ACH, so at least you got that done. Well, thanks so much for joining us. You stick around for lunch?
Yep. I will be around almost all the day. I really would love to hear other Stripe thoughts, questions, feedback. If you don't see me, I'm patrick@stripe.com, and I will read all those emails. And
hopefully I can convince him to stick around for the evening event. It's TBD right now, but I would really like to have some folks be able to chat with you.
That would be great. Thank you.